Thank you, Khiun, for such fascinating talk on REFers. And our second speaker is Liew Khiun. Khiun obtained his BA and MA from National University of Singapore and his PhD from Wellcome Trust Centre for the History of Medicine at University College London. He's currently an assistant professor at the VWOs School of Communication and Information at NTU. Khiun's research interests cover that of civil society in Malaya and Singapore, heritage informatics and mapping, as well as that of popular culture and society. He has also been involved in a range of civil society groups, conservation, migrant workers, and animal welfare. Khiun's talk this evening is titled Before and Beyond the Banyan Tree, the Myth of Civil Society in Singapore. So please join me in welcoming.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Speaking about REFers, for those who have kids who've just gotten PSL results above 250, congratulations if you are doing the REFers institution. For me, I think in 1985 I obtained 205. Enough to spare me the rod for getting into express stream, but unfortunately not into REFers institution. So I went to this place, which is now the Singapore Art Museum. So in the past it was St. Joseph Institution. So maybe it explains probably my research profile with the probably with the subordinator, with the subordinate, because you're always, number 4, number 5 right behind, always facing the wrath of the dominant discourse, which was called a cane in those days. Maybe just something about myself, aside from the very generous introduction from Jack. On a normal day, if you read the Straits Times carefully, you probably see my commentaries about television dramas, pop music, cyberbullying, etc. because of the school I come from, communication school. But this is actually the talk tonight. It's probably part of my earlier research for my PhD on colonial civil society in British Malaya. And this has actually brought me to many places, thanks to not just the National University of Singapore, but University College London as well, to show how, globally connected Singapore is in terms of not just trade and commerce, but also ideas and ideology, the circulation of thoughts, the competition for visions, actually, which I would probably talk about just a little bit more. But if you talk about civil society in Singapore today, it is almost like a bad word, right? It's like human rights. Don't talk about human rights. It should be from a development perspective rather than from a rights perspective. This was actually what was said by the MP, one of the PAP MPs, who is also the head of the migrant workers, government-sponsored migrant workers organization. And all this are kind of conveniently or sheepishly put away as something that is politically inconvenient, for the efficient administration of the state in Singapore. And I think for some of you who have been involved in civil society activities, NGO groups, you would understand what I mean quite clearly. But for those who do not, maybe it's just, I want to probably go back just a little bit about how we understand not just civil society history in Singapore, but civil society and history in general. For those who have gone through the Singapore history syllabus, it's always, like many places in the world, it's always marked, the milestones are marked by changes in the head of state or the governance in the past. So it's always about administrations, it's always about political change from the kind of macro scale. And so some of the dates that if you grew up in this country, even if you are suffering from dementia at old age, in Johor Bahru, you will remember 1890. You will remember 1965. You may or may not remember 2011, which was the last general election, but you will remember two people, even you have forgotten who your wife is. And you will remember two people, that's like Raffles and Lee Kuan Yew. And you will be inundated, I think, for the past few months, with more books. And in the bookshops here in Singapore, the local section is always about one person, predominantly. And they even have a comic version of him, like Harry, when he was a kid. And so this is so overarching that we probably have forgotten, there are other kind of underlying, undercurrent forces at work that may have shaped what society is today in this island city-state called Singapore. But just think of the discourse that you have been taught about in your histories here of Singapore, that it is just founded by Raffles, brought it to a modern city-state from a fishing village. It's always this thing about a fishing village. I love fishing village, but but it seemed to be something really, really bad. And then from 1959, it was brought up further to an urban, contemporary, very sophisticated metropolis. And so this is the kind of discourse you have. And for those who have been to the Radio Talks exhibition in the National Library, full of fury, and the kind of the dark age of the communist threat, you actually can pick some of these postcards up to give to your friends, send them overseas. Some of them have like this Soviet flag, the myth, it's not a toy flag, and a burnout card, no, it's not an accident. So you can send out that for Christmas greeting cards, perhaps, about this like nasty 80s communist united front. So this is the kind of narrative, the building of the what academics would use in this term called the party state, which defines the post-colonial modern nation state in Singapore. I've just gotten a copy of the coffee table book about the commemorative PAP 60th anniversary. So it's always about dudes in white shirts. Probably more women nowadays, but still very much of the narrative of the state. Beyond that, it seems that you do not have much of a voice in this mainstream discourse. You don't study about NGO groups in history, except these clan associations and self-help groups that you would see to be quite fossilized, that are limited to certain groups, certain ethnic groups that now, fortunately, the nation state has done away with them in some ways, but brought back in a kind of different kind of racial classifications in another way. So therefore, this has been a narrative that many people have been brought up with, the narrative of the party state, that the state takes primacy. Yes, you should have, ground-up initiative, which, is quite, we live in a kind of a paradox in this country, or kind of schizophrenic contradiction. Maybe this is my training in medical history, that the state in Singapore has been instrumental in actually removing most of these villages or kampongs in this country, except of this this tiny little outpost in Bangkok near Yio Chu Kang. If you just want to have a kampong life, but I think you better start interviewing them before the residents start charging you for for these interviews, because they are getting quite sick of being asked about what was the kampong spirit like. And of course, Pulau Ubin, which Nature Society has put hopefully the proposals to keep it as what it is, instead of, maybe succumbing to suggestions to have ATM machines there in Pulau Ubin. You know, why do we need to have ATM machines? Maybe the crabs there are quite expensive, perhaps. And so, you should have this community spirit, but it should be part of what the politicians here have framed it very carefully, called the civic society, rather than civil society. Civic society means this communitarian organizations that would help to, clean the streets, give you a boat to clean up the mess in the rivers. Basically, such supplementary functions. I mean, I see it probably sometimes a little bit more cynically, unfortunately, in getting people to absorb part of the social cost of development. When the state reach is conveniently limited, and maybe society initiative comes in, except when you shouldn't be harassing through internet vigilantes, dodgy vendors from Sin Ling Square. So it actually stops at that. It's great that you can raise money for the poor Vietnamese tourist that was begging on his knees, to get the refund, but it stops at there. It stops at challenging or even supplanting the authority of the state. So this is the kind of discourse that most people are actually being fed with in this country, and they actually, it's not, I would not want to put the kind of value judgment to it, whether it's a good or bad thing, because I think in many countries, in many developing countries, it's not also a good thing for NGOs to take over, like in Tanzania or even Cambodia, to run an entire show. And but what is interesting is the kind of totality of the reach. So, I mean, people would always say that Singapore is a police state. I actually would maybe qualify it a little further. We're not really that a police state. We are a core police state. So for every minor things, you actually reach out to the phone to call the police. I mean, my friend who used to live in Texas told me that once she tried calling the cops over a situation that maybe the neighbor was getting violent, and the cops asked her that you have a gunman, to protect yourself first, will take some time to come over. But I think here in Singapore, you can expect like 15 minutes to probably a half an hour. I mean, I've done that before, so, and anything more than that, you can actually complain. So, okay, jokes aside, probably what I'm trying to come back again, perhaps, is what my research in colonial civil society have informed me about. Yes, it was a really fun undertaking. Most historical research would just be limited to, going to the Khiun gardens, early in the morning, lining up with, a lot of people, including those who are waiting to look at their grandfather's histories. That the search for civil society has brought me to interesting places in London, like the Anglican Church. When I have to knock at this like heavy old wooden door to be, shown into the archives. The Women's Library in Brick Lane. I mean, for those who know London, Brick Lane is quite a kind of South Asian space now. So very colorful area with very good food, but I think the Singaporean in me was kind of exhibiting when I did research there during summer, and they did not have aircon. And not only that, but thanks to the generosity of the Rockefeller Archive Center, another two-plus week trip to this place off Terrytown, which was a very beautiful summer retreat of the Rockefellers. Lovely place, but they have turned it into an archive center, and I had an embarrassing incident once when I actually used a place in the kitchen that was actually meant for display, for my cheap Italian pizza which I bought. And I think they probably have locked that up from then on. And not only that, but even to Geneva as well. I mean, it's not the most interesting place for Singaporeans to expect, shops to be open after 5. And I I mean, so this actually shows the kind of diversity in colonial civil society, and maybe I can get back to that. What sort of searches, why did I go to these places? You know? What has a women's archive got to do with colonial society in Singapore? What has the United Nations archives got to do with something in the 1920s and 30s? And what has, maybe for those who, I mean, the Anglican Church is actually a much easier connection to draw. But to show the kind of diversity that and, yes, and not only that, St. John's Ambulance in East London as well. So why did I go to these places? Because, you know, it has such a rich story here. I mean, we are given the impression now in the kind of contemporary understanding of civil society in Singapore that it's not just a kind of like middle-class people indulging in issues that are not bread and butter. But I think that the issues that are kind of parochialized. You know, but in the past, you know, this is one interesting facade of colonial society. So it's not just trade or commerce that Khiun really talked about, but the flow of ideas. You know, people were influenced internationally by the kind of ideas that were coming out around the world. And ideas that are mainly that of how society is being not just regulated, but envisioned. So maybe I just borrow from Khiun's talk about Farquhar and Raffles, bringing that back. We can't escape Raffles, unfortunately. But bringing back to a little debate that was actually registered or documented in Wakefield's 100 Years of Singapore's History, that he found William Farquhar's policy of distributing spirit and opium and farms in the new colony to be totally unacceptable to the principles of the foundation of the colony. Sounds familiar, right? The debate, you know. We have this debate here today, you know, and with the alcohol. I mean, unfortunately for shisha smokers, you know, yeah, the days are quite numbered. But there is a kind of moral or foundational, civilizational discourse that, you know, you can claim that Raffles was very Victorian about it, that maybe he did not understand. This was what colonial administrators would argue with advocates, that they do not understand these oriental societies with their own dynamics. So for example, you know, just this, there's this huge 7-volume, you know, commission in looking about opium in the British Empire. And, you know, you have all these debates that, you know, opium was great, you know, that, you know, people were more relaxed, it caused less trouble compared to spirits in the West, you know, and with drunkards especially. But what I'm coming to get back at, that colonial society, civil society was not just about providing welfare services to the poor. Yes, that was a very, very important component. This was what medical missions ran mainly by women did with maternal health. This was what merchants did with hospitals and other welfare provisions, because my thesis was more on like health provisions. And even that of St. John's Ambulance, you know, initiating first aid courses as early as 1935 to provide for the eventual preparation of a possible war in the Far East, as they have understood that. And but I think even today, if you are involved with any NGOs, you do not just, I mean, there's a limit in how much trash of the river that you can clean before telling the government that, hey, something is very wrong. And, you know, something needs to be done. that you cannot be just scooping water from a hole in a ship, you know, the hole has to be patched up, you know, and it probably depends how you put it. You want to put it courteously, or you want to, you know, scream and yell about it. So they're not just providing additional medical or welfare facilities, but they are also kind of envisioning something different. I would actually put it in this ideal of you have among these groups people with ideals, people with visions. For example, when the Rockefeller Foundation came over, they had this grandiose global ambitions in not just eradicating hookworms. And interestingly about hookworms, right? I'm glad that, I hope you guys have your dinners now, that you just finished your dinner, but it was the Rockefeller Foundation that actually spearheaded the provisions of modern toilets in the colony. Through the anti-hookworm program, through telling people that you have to wear shoes, and through having a more modern idea of public health or even health education. So unlike the British administrators that were more interested in just policing bodies, the Rockefeller Foundation officials have this, what you call lantern shows in this part of the colonies. Actually, many people saw the moving image for the first time through this film called Unhooking the Hookworm. You would think of it as an art house film today. You know, this little thing, you know, black and white image going through the screen, you know, sickly looking boy in the southern part of the United States. But it was shown in many places. It got people very excited. They did hookworm demonstrations as well. They collected stool samples and they showed people that this came out from your body. I mean, actually, part of me, you know, if I had time, I would want to kind of recreate this kind of installation. You know, it's really multi-dimensional. But I don't think you can hookworm much from anyone in Singapore today. So new ideas, new ways of thinking about things. New types of mobilization that the colonial state has never thought of doing. For example, it was St. John's Ambulance that have mobilized people from a more diverse backgrounds. You would have thought that colonial civil society would mainly be limited to just the European and comprador classes through the newspapers, through public forums, and through town hall meetings, but they provided the bulk of the people involved in passive defense force when war came to Malaya. And I think if you guys have time to look at one interesting document written by George Maxwell on the passive defense of Malaya, when the Japanese took over the British Command Center, I think in Fort Canning, the men have all disappeared. It was the women that were left still manning the radio controls. So that was a part that maybe has not been that widely featured. But maybe aside from this provision, I think the more interesting part came in the area of advocacy. And this is where the politics of abolition came in two areas, mainly prostitution and narcotics. So the politics of pleasure has been quite core in Singapore's history. It's not a recent development. It's not something that is always associated with hanging people with 15 grams of drugs, of heroin, but something longer. Maybe I can start with prostitution first. This was considered the El Dorado of the East, mainly male migrants coming in. So prostitution was very rife in many aspects. And the British Empire and many colonies have this policy of through the Contagious Disease Ordinance of the mandatory examination of women. Men were not examined. So you have a growing women's groups, a mixture of social hygiene groups, a mixture of feminists in Europe that were actually clamoring for the abolition of such a regulation that they claim were meant to make women clean for sex. So they actually pushed for its abolition, which I think came through in the 1870s. The local administrators wanted to bring it back in the 1920s again, especially when the troop buildup was gathering momentum. And they got the International Alliance to monitor the situation. League of Nations, so this is the Geneva Connections. League of Nations were also involved. They have sent 2 commissions over to this part of the world to examining, interestingly, the trafficking of women and children. For those who are following the scene in Singapore, you would think that it's a recent phenomenon, with the bill being debated in Parliament, but this has been going on for a very, very long time, for I think close to 70, 80 years. This is actually a problem that is not just associated with the issues today. But the advocacy has also a longer history in the process as well. Similar to that of opium consumption, although, I would qualify that there are still debates about opium culture and narcotics culture itself. Some people thought it was a kind of imposition of Chinese nationalist values on an otherwise popular kind of consumption. But nevertheless, the temperance groups also gained momentum in this part of the region, trying to get the government to restrict its sales, distribution, and consumption, and also trying to get it to provide healthier facilities. Bear in mind that I think our impressions of opium here is a kind of sickly, mainly ethnic Chinese male on the streets, kind of looking emaciated and wasted. But for many of these people in the past, this was the only ointment, perhaps the only kind of relief that they could have in opening up the jungles in Malaya, in working at the harbour. So this was the only source of relief that was available back then. But you also have the same abolitionists, but this time with comprador classes, people like, very well, Oriental and Lim Boon Keng. But I think unfortunately, if you ask maybe any young person today about Lim Boon Keng, they would think it's the MRT station. So they have also acquired the ideas of modern science and technology. And they also use the tools to champion for different causes. So I think in short, I would want to say that there's much to look at, and civil society in this country is not just the kind of confines of middle-class people who have nothing better to do or to look at the world in very tinted, idealized lenses. It has a longer history. It has a vision that it still remains to be debated even till today and maybe in future. So I think with that, thank you very much, and I will leave the floor to Philip.